In this episode of Trust Talk, join Dutch legal and corporate experts Peter Wakkie and Tjeerd Wassenaar as they discuss the critical role of trust in corporations. With Peter's extensive background as a board member of large companies and Tjeerd's experience as a general counsel, they offer a wealth of knowledge on managing crises and enhancing corporate governance. They provide actionable insights on building and maintaining trust, even in challenging situations, and discuss practical strategies for crisis management and risk assessment. Their conversation also emphasizes the importance of ethical leadership in today's business environment. Your hosts today, Severin de Wit.
Welcome to Trust Talk, Peter and Tjeerd. Before we start, can you briefly tell us a bit how you ended up where you are now?
Yeah, so brief history on my background. Started as a lawyer in private practice at two Dutch law firms, Loef van der Brouw. And then I moved into different corporate roles. And during those roles, I think the red line and the most important thing for me has always been deep interest in business and also the interaction between legal and business, and also the theme of ethics. During my work at Ahold, I've done a lot on ethics. And also in roles after that, that has always been a main theme for me. And that's also now a big part of the work I do now around governance and ethics. So that is in a nutshell my background.
Yes, so I also started as a lawyer in private practice a long time ago. Then I moved to Ahold as a director. Thereafter, I returned to private practice. I'm still practicing attorney. I've also been on various boards of supervisory directors in listed companies.
Warren Buffett once said that, and I'm quoting, "Risk is not knowing what you are doing. But even when you do know what you're doing, surprises can still happen, right? So when unexpected things happen, even though you're not prepared, it affects how much people trust you. Have you faced situations like this, and how did you keep or rebuild that trust despite the surprises?"
I can give an example on that. For instance, in an M&A situation where two parties need to work together and come together and form one company, both sides typically have a professional team, they have professional advisors, and then just when you think that you're prepared to go on that journey and close the deal, sometimes unexpected things happen. And one example I would like to mention is the Corona situation. I experienced myself an M&A situation where both teams were ready, and then Corona broke out, and suddenly you have to close a deal over the phone, over a lot of team meetings, and that, I think, affects trust, because it's much harder to come together as a team, work together, and do a transformation if you're not physically together and do not meet each other in person and know a little bit more about the person you're dealing with. I think Corona was typical of a situation where you need to adjust yourself, and how can you build that trust among the teams? And that, I think, requires that you deliver on the goods. And what I mean by that is that you make sure that you do what you promise to do, and that you stay professional, that you stay on a moral high ground, and that you, in that sense, build trust with the other party.
I've been in situations where there was a crisis, and it's very important that the board members then act as a unified body. And for that, you need to have good relationships with your other board members. You need to know them also on a personal level, because if you don't, then in a crisis situation, you have diverging views. Board members are not willing to delegate a responsibility for dealing with the crisis to a few individuals, and you need to do that to be effective. And also then if there's no common trust, then board members may wish to preserve their own individual reputation instead of working for the collective good, because they have all other board positions as well. They want to protect those board positions from what is happening in a crisis. So it's very important that you not only have a formal good relationship with your fellow board members, but also that you know and trust each other at an individual level.
Peter, I've heard you have some strong opinions about bringing in external advisors during a company trust crisis. It's an interesting take, especially with your deep experience in dealing with these tough situations. What's your view on this?
Now, my opinion is not necessarily concerned with external advisors per se or in general, because you need external advisors when there's a crisis. It's more about communication strategy that I was more hesitant than the communication experts, because you have to balance the need for transparency to your stakeholders and the public in general with the need to protect the company and its assets against litigation. And so these are two conflicting priorities, because anything that you say can be used against you later on in a court proceeding or with supervising authorities. My advice is, do not let your strategy be totally consumed by what the communication experts tell you.
I would add, Severin, as well, that if you hire litigation lawyers and other specialists, that you try to determine the objectives that you want to achieve as a company and as a board. And you need to have an idea where you want to end up. And I say that because, in particular with litigation lawyers, they are very convincing people by nature. They have to convince a court, or in the US, a jury. And they can be very convincing to board members as well. And I think it's important that you stay in control as a board and don't let the advisors take control. And that will require some debate and sometimes a clash or different views. But you always need to go back to the objectives that you have set as a board and take it from there, and don't let the advisors take control.
There is this idea that managing a crisis isn't just about reacting to chaos as it happens. It's more like being one step ahead, spotting risks early and keeping them from turning into full-blown fires. It's about safeguarding the company's reputation, its day-to-day running, and making sure people can still trust. How do you tackle this? What's your strategy for keeping an eye on potential threats and dealing them before they blow up?
Well, it's all about information, because companies have risk profiles and they list the risks in terms of severity, the chance that they will happen. But still, not everything is foreseeable. What I've learned is that in a company, especially multinationals, you need to have good central coordination at the highest level. That means that you also need to have people working at subsidiaries in responsible positions like finance or risk management, because often crisis happens because in one or more subsidiaries there's insufficient control and they go their own direction and they don't give you. Not all the information that is at subsidiary level is then also available at company headquarters. That's what I've seen in a couple of instances. So it's all about having good central coordination and getting the information early from around the companies.
You mentioned risk. I would like to talk a little bit about risk governance and trust within a company. Specifically, how does effective risk governance contribute to building and maintaining trust, particularly in situations that test an organization's resilience?
I think there's a saying, we will trust you, but we will verify. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said that to the Russians about non-proliferation of nuclear arms. He wanted to trust the Russians, but he wanted to verify as well. And I think that's an important principle. It's good to trust people, and trust empowers people, but you need structure and corporate hygiene as well. So I think the two go hand in hand.
We always have this debate in the Netherlands about principles versus rules. Most people in Europe and in the Netherlands are more inclined to use principles. I like more the priority to be given to rules, because rules are clear. So if you tell people in a company you cannot accept gifts from anybody, well, that's clear. I mean, there are no exceptions. Not like, you cannot do it unless there's business rationale for doing it, because the people get confused. And the funny thing is, if you have rules and you enforce the rules, and there are not too many rules, but you need to balance that a little bit, all of a sudden they become your DNA as a company. That's very strange. But if you tell people enough about what they should do or should not do, then it becomes the DNA of the company. So it translates then into behavior.
I want to briefly talk about the 3 lines of defense model. What is your experience with this and when it really is a crisis? Could you share some examples of how the 3 lines have been effectively put into action to either stop a crisis before it happens or handle one that's underway, keeping the company stable?
Well, I think it's good if you have in a company a culture where bad news travels as fast as good news. Because what you typically see is that good news goes to the top very fast. But if things go wrong or there is a problem or a luring problem, then it's not that easy to communicate to management. So as a cultural thing, I think that is very important that you as management foster and stimulate people to bring bad news as well, because then you can still act. And especially these days with the global media, social media, if a local situation happens in a global company, it's never local anymore. Within an hour, it can be a global reputation thing. So I think as management, you need to educate your people and tell them if there is a problem, make sure that your manager knows, and then it goes up the chain of command.
I totally agree with Tjeerd, the fact that bad news has a more difficult trajectory than good news. That's absolutely the case. I've seen 3 lines of defense at work. There are 2 things that you need to realize. First of all, it has to be more than paperwork and charters, because you see in a lot of companies that everybody that works in the second line of defense prepares a charter. It's a compliance charter, a risk charter, privacy charter. But it's much more important that the people in the second line of defense also go on a journey of discovery. You have to go to the different units around the globe and test what you think is happening. Because if you're only at headquarters making rules or charters, that is not going to work. And also education is also very important. You have to go out to the business and tell them what you expect, tell them what the rules are, the procedures. Continuous education is key to keeping the 3 lines of defense working well. And you also have to have integration. So not that there are all different silos in the lines of defense. It needs to be integrated.
Have you some examples of how this works?
Yeah, but I will not name companies. But I've said one time that I saw, a compliance charter, 40 pages. And I said, well, but have you been able to go through the various locations around the globe and see whether the things that you assume are actually correct? No, nobody had done that. And, then it exploded in one of these locations because the person in charge there had different ideas about compliance. And these things you can avoid by being on location instead of being just at headquarters.
I would also add that, for instance, if an internal audit is a global function and you have a global company, it's very important indeed that internal audit actually visits the countries. So if you look at a rotation scheme or a visiting scheme of internal audit in their year plan, I always look at, does internal audit actually visit the business? Because sometimes you see that certain management teams don't get a visit from internal audit for many years. And then you can create a situation where the local team feels very confident in what they do and maybe a bit overconfident. So that ties into Peter's comment that internal audit needs to move around, and don't save on travel for internal audit would be my advice.
And also, to Tjeerd's point, internal audit should also have an independent reporting line to the audit committee of the supervisory board. I've seen in situations, although there are of course exceptions, where internal audit and the CFO were too much a team, so that the internal audit did not really want to or dare to report misgivings about the financial situation in the company.
From a Stanford University publication called Closer Look, I take the quote, "Corporate governance systems exist to discourage self-interested behavior." Would it be a good description of what corporate governance is about, and more importantly, does it work?
Well, I think corporate governance is much broader than that. It's about the hygiene of a company, it's the different interactions between management, the supervisory board, the shareholders, the other stakeholders. So I think, no, this description is not really good.
I think it's more about responsibility and accountability and a rebalancing of powers in an organization. and that you make sure that everybody knows who's responsible for what, and that you also have a culture where people will be held accountable for their actions, and that nobody can act on its own and get rogue behaviors. I would say corporate governance is more about balance.
In the Netherlands, we lean towards the stakeholder model, meaning that we are looking out for everyone involved, not just the shareholders like the agency theory in the US often focuses on. I'm curious, have you seen cases where this more inclusive approach really make a difference in how a company was run? And how do you think paying attention to all stakeholders, not just the shareholders, changes the game for a company's management and its overall success?
Yeah, I've seen many instances of that because, for example, if you have a takeover contest, then in Britain and the US, generally speaking, the highest price wins it. So the bidder with the highest price. That's definitely not the case in continental Europe or in the Netherlands, because you see that the boards can also weigh non-financial characteristics of a transaction, and they do so. So it's definitely not the highest price that always wins. It's also a lot of attention to non-financial governance for the protection of other stakeholders like the workforce that you can legitimize in this environment and not necessarily in a UK or US environment.
I would also add that it's indeed not only about price in continental Europe, but also that you look at your core values. If you have, for instance, a company that is very much focused on safety in the petrochemical industry or another industry where safety is a very important topic, like construction is the same, I think that a board will also look at what is the safety culture in this other company, and does that match with our culture? Because if you mix the two and the two have a different standard, you can get into a lot of troubles because it touches your very core. So I think those elements are important as well.
Figuring out how long a CEO should stick around is quite the dilemma. Everyone wants that steady hand, especially when everything around us is changing so fast. There's this idea floating around about CEOs sticking to 2 4-year periods, but even that's up for debate. In your experience, how do you balance keeping things steady with the need to shake things up with new leadership?
Well, it's all about quality. If the CEO performs well, he or she may stay as long as is warranted. I don't believe in these hard and fast rules. I've seen CEOs that are already out of energy in 2 years, and I have CEOs that go on for 10 years or more and be very successful. So I don't think there's one rule. And it's also about horses for courses. I've seen CEOs that perform very well in a crisis situation, but after that are definitely not up to the same standard. And I've seen CEOs that I would not want to have in a crisis situation, but are definitely more steady in running a company when it's in a normal time. So it's no one rule for me.
I would also say that it depends if the CEO is somebody from within the company or outside, or that it is actually the founder of the company. Because if the founder is CEO, well, he definitely will be that for more than 2 terms, but the founder is also seen as the true leader of the company and is often an example for staff and an embodiment of the culture of the company. So, and that can be a very strong thing. And that is something you typically should cherish, if that is the right culture, of course. So a founder, I think, is more qualified to stay on longer. And then the other thing I would say is that succession planning is also an important topic. So if a CEO is not in favor of good succession planning in his company, then I think that is a red flag, because a good leader always thinks about succession and will foster talent and develop talent in the organization. And if that is not the case, I think that is a problem. So that's the other point I wanted to make.
The last thing I would like to discuss with you is the debate that's going around these days about the business climate here in the Netherlands, especially concerning the relationship between businesses and the government. It seems like there's a growing feeling among businesses that they can't fully trust the government to prioritize their interests. From your viewpoint, how do you see the situation? What impact do you think this trust gap, if I may call that, could have on the business environment?
Well, I think in the Netherlands there have been quite some debates going on around ASML and other companies. And I think in general, companies would value if a government has a long-term view and a long-term strategy and also stability. So that will enable companies to invest and make long-term decisions. And that not always matches with the political agenda, which is more on the 4-year trajectory. So I think the debate in the Netherlands is really how can we get government to think more long-term and beyond elections and create a stable business environment.
It's a problem of all times. I think it's not just now. Yeah, it pops up now and then. It has to do with the fact that not many politicians come from the business world. It's very few of them. On the other hand, also very few business people come from politics. So there's a disconnect in terms of trust also, because we have had all these incidents about remuneration. Politicians cannot understand or that some people earn a lot of money in multinational companies, and the multinational companies do not understand why politicians do not appreciate that they are in a field of competition. So it's always about that. I don't see an easy solution. It is because there are two different sets of backgrounds actually. And I don't know now, because of companies leaving the Netherlands, it's now more focus for politics, but definitely not all the politicians. So I don't know. It's going to be continued. It will be continued. It's not going to be solved easily.
Okay, well, thank you both for being our guest, and wish you in your work all the best, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.